Hey, good morning. Welcome to the Stochastic.com MLB strategy show. Friday, what is it? March 29th. 8 games, 6:50 start. Coming off opening day. Talking to Greg prior to the show. Results wise, not the best. I did not have a great day, great evening. I know you didn't either, but this was one where you go back and you look at like the post-contest simulator and everything. All the 150 maxers and essentially like all of the really good players did not have profitable nights. It was a really weird slate.
Well, also though, just kind of the nature, not just of baseball, playing 150 lineups, I expect to lose money every single night, if that makes sense. So like the individual lineups are expected to be plus EV, but just the variance of large field tournaments. Like yesterday, for instance, on DraftKings, there was 107, 150 maxers. 7 of them were profitable out of 107. Of those 7 that were profitable, none of them were significantly profitable. It was all like minor profits. That's just kind of how it goes playing 150 lineups. So it's kind of the nature of MLB DFS and some of the variants, but you keep building lineups, and then kind of like basketball season where I've hit a handful of GPPs this year, you're going to lose most slates you don't end up winning. It's just kind of how it goes playing a lot of tournaments.
Yeah, even if you're not 150 maxing, just in general, like you're not always going into something with the expectation that you're going to win. But what I mean by it was a weird slate was, and you and I talked about this before we started, like there were no real bad pitching performances of guys that you were actually considered playing, right? Like Glasnow, Reagans, Scooble, even Crochet had a solid. Who else am I missing? Darvish, I think, was pretty good.
Luzardo was good. If you basically any pitcher you guys considered, if they were like a reasonable option, they probably scored between like 19 and 25 fantasy
exactly
points.
Yeah. And then some of the, I mean, you look at some of those games, Detroit had what looked to be a good matchup. You know, they're still Detroit. No, it's only one game, but like a rough game from Detroit. Cincinnati, it was mostly what Martini had 5 RBIs, didn't he? I think he had like 2 homers and 5 RBIs.
Yeah, he had the most fantasy points of any skill position player by a pretty wide margin. He finished with 34. There was 26 out of Michael Conforto, 25 from Freddie Freeman. But yeah, Nick Martini, the cheap price point, he was somebody at 5% ownership. Kind of had to have. I had a couple of live lineups later on in the slate, which really is that's if you're playing 150 lineups, you're very dependent on one of those lineups breaking into like the top 5 in a GPP to be like significantly profitable for a day. And yeah, you needed to have Nick Martini. I had him in, I think it was either 5 or 6% of lineups, which was about even with the field. But like, yeah, he was just a random guy you needed to have.
Yeah. And we'll get into this one as well. But yeah, it was and Minnesota comes out of the gate with a homer. And I go, okay, maybe that win will have an impact. And I think that finished like 2-1 or something. So
yeah, so that game, there was 2 home runs hit in the first inning.
yes, 1 on each side.
It finished 4-1 just because there weren't that many high-scoring teams. The Twins actually did end up being one of the higher-scoring stacks on the slate. But yeah, there was only a couple of good offenses.
Anyway, ready to talk some Friday baseball here?
Let's do it. Let's get into it.
All right. I should point out, too, happy to have you guys with us. If you haven't done so yet, take one single second. It's been a while since I've said this. Atone for your sins here on a Friday morning, heading into the weekend. Hit that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, help us get to 100K subscribers. That would be wonderful. Then we'd have 2 channels with 100,000. Wouldn't that be nice, Greg? 200,000 subscriber channels.
We're close to it on the stochastic side.
We need like
2,800 away, something like
that. Yeah,
like
2,800, a little less than 2,800. And hey, leave a comment down below if you're listening or watching after the fact. We see you. Always read and respond to those comments. And if you ever wanted to maybe not watch or listen on YouTube, maybe you don't have YouTube Premium, you don't want to deal with the ads, everything we do here that has a shelf life, you can find it in podcast form. Whether it's, Apple Podcast, Spotify, whatever that weird one is that Josh listens to, we got you all covered there. Anyway, happy to have you guys with us. Let's talk a little baseball today. And if you're curious what on the sidebar those numbers are, and you're new to baseball, those are implied totals, right? Implied run totals. So make things a little bit easier. You can see which teams have higher and lower totals for today. Greg, there are 5 teams with sub 4. only two teams and so you got Arizona at 5.5 and the Dodgers at 5.6. So we'll dive into all this. We can start with Toronto and Tampa Bay. Looking at this one, both low total in this game. Again, you're going to see a lot of that, especially the first couple days of the season. Chris Bassett, Aaron Savali. I want to start with stacks here for a second, and then we can get into pitching. Both teams 3.9, 4.3 run implied totals. Are there any quality stacking options or individual bats in this game that you're looking at?
So as far as individual batters, I don't typically look too much. Like, I don't really care about individual batters
Me
in
neither.
baseball because all my lineups are stacks. It's not really something I ever do consider all that much. I do pretty strongly think that the pitchers are not great options for this game, particularly because both of them are picking up ownership. We do have Savali projected for 15% ownership, Bassett projected for 14.4. $7,200 for Savali is a cheap price point, $8,600 for Bassett on DraftKings. Also, two guys who on FanDuel single pitcher site, no real reason to consider them, but I think both of them are fairly over-owned, especially with pitcher ownership being flat, and then especially the price point on Chris Bassett on the road against the Tampa Bay Rays. So in terms of individual batters, I don't really have a great answer for you, but as far as the pitchers go, I hate both of them relative to their ownership.
Yeah, these well, and we should take a look at this too. We can pull up the Sims, we can pull up ownership and the top stacks tool. But if you're looking at just both pitchers here, in context to the rest of the slate, they are, as you mentioned, 14 and 13% owned. Chris Bassett, yeah, not cheap. $8,600 on DraftKings. Savali 7,200. Then you've got a few guys that are down there that are just going to be entirely unowned, like Cal Quantrill against Arizona. I don't see any reason you'd look to get to that spot today, especially look, he's not even going to get run support. Martin Perez against Miami, another really ugly spot with an underwhelming low upside pitcher. Zach Thompson against the Dodgers, Kyle Harrison. I think there's a few spots like Ross Stripling against Cleveland. Carlos Rodon, we can get into that against Houston, but a lefty going up against Houston, tough spot. I think there's probably going to be 5 or 6 spots at pitcher that we just write off today.
Yeah, probably even more than that, actually. And for different reasons, right? Because like it's not like I look at somebody like Savali or Bass and be like, oh, these pitchers are terrible. It's just there's better options than them. They also don't have the easiest matchups. And then on top of that as well, like these pitchers, because they're not terrible, I'm not super interested in stacking against them either. So I don't have exposure to these pitchers in any kind of meaningful way. But then the offenses, I'm also not really landing on them. If you look at, and I'm sure that Jordan has the Sims results up on screen right there, but I've got like a couple of Rays stacks. I've got a couple of Toronto stacks, but it's not anything that's crazy significant. And then Chris Bassett, $8,600 on DraftKings, certainly not a price point I want to pay for him. I don't want to roster him on single entry sites. He's somebody who regressed a pretty good amount last year in multiple ways. First off, fastball velocity way down. This is somebody who was actually pitching fairly well with the Oakland A's before he departed. He went from Oakland, he went to the Mets, then he's on Toronto last year. And we've seen over the last few years a slow degradation in his fastball velocity. In 2019, it was 94 miles per hour, then went to 93.6, 93.5, 93.3, then all the way down to 92.5 last year. As a result, 4.04 expected ERA, 3.6 was his actual ERA, and his strikeout rate has also seen decreases. So this is a guy who has a pretty healthy price tag and just doesn't have all that much upside in this matchup, or really in general, in my opinion.
And this was a Rays team that was second in WRC plus against righties last year, behind only the Braves. So, with a league average strikeout rate, this isn't exactly a spot where you go, all right, well, Chris Bassett's pretty good, but the matchup is so good that I can't get away from it. Like I think you mentioned it, but the matchup is pretty underwhelming too.
Yeah, and it's both sides of the game. It's like decent offenses, pitchers are okay, but Bassett's expensive. The Rays, not the Rays, the Blue Jays offense is also fairly expensive. This is a game that I have almost no interest in either side of.
Let's talk about Pittsburgh and Miami. This one a little bit different. Clearly not the best park, but Miami 4.6 run implied total against the Pirates and Martin Perez. So, I mean, look, if we know one thing about Perez, it's amazing that he's still making starts, by the way. But not someone that's going to get you anything as far as strikeouts go. Last year, with the Rangers, how many starts did he, or how many, he threw 141 and 2/3 innings. Greg, he had a 15% strikeout rate on the year. This is just kind of what's to be expected of somebody like him. He's not a particularly great ground ball pitcher. He's just always been someone that could manage by being okay. But 1.33 home runs per 9 last year. He does give up some power. What do you think? First of all, the pitching matchups on both sides of this one, if you want to get into that, we can. But I think AJ Puck is going to be a lot different looking for us against the Pittsburgh Pirates than Martin Perez against Miami. And we may be looking to some Marlin bats here.
Yeah, so AJ Puck, by the way, is the pitcher I get the most exposure to overall on the slate right now. He's just not priced appropriately. He's very cheap. And of the other cheap pitching options, he's just by far the best overall one that we have to look at. And then Martin Perez, like you had said, basically the inverse, where Martin Perez, even a couple of years ago when he was a decent real life pitcher, not somebody we were ever rostering for fantasy purposes just because of a lack of strikeout upside. So Martin Perez is a pitcher who, there was a point in time where I thought he was really, really terrible, but he has pretty consistently outperformed his peripheral stats. It'd be great if Fangraphs was working for me right now and wasn't just loaded up with a million ads on the page to where it's making it impossible for me to see any of the stats that are on the page. But that aside, like, no, I don't want to buy a steak from a pop-up on Fangraphs right now. But Martin Perez has historically been a pitcher who has lower ERAs than what his underlying stats suggest, but it's been fairly consistent. And if you look at him last year, it was some of the same, 4.45 ERA, which isn't great, but still he had a 4.9 expected ERA, 4.99 FIP. The year before he had the best year of his career, still was well outperforming his peripheral stats, 2.89 ERA, 3.59 expected ERA. But even in that season, he was not somebody we were playing in DFS because his strikeout rate is 16% for his career, which is not far off from the 15.3% that you had just mentioned before, Lofty. So yeah, Martin Perez is basically a no-go as far as somebody who I would want to roster. And then stacking against him, actually do think would normally be something that we might consider in certain spots, but the Marlins are very popular. We've got the Marlins projected for 9.7% ownership as a team. We have them as one of the more overowned teams on the entire slate. So my exposure to the Marlins is primarily going to be coming from AJ Puck. Just based on what the ownership of the Marlins is. I'm getting them into some lineups. I have 5% exposure to Miami, but that's about half of what the field has.
We got to talk about AJ Puck here for a second, because his spring training, first of all, was like absurd. 5 1/3 innings last time out, 8 strikeouts on 37 pitches. 3 1/3, 6 strikeouts, 3 innings, 6 strikeouts, 2 innings, 3 strikeouts. But the most he threw was 46 pitches. And we're still talking about somebody who's never made a start in the majors. So I guess really the question now becomes, how many pitches can we expect him to throw? The strikeout stuff is clearly there. I don't think there's any denying that. Like elite strikeout stuff, without question. Now, clearly, that translates different from a bullpen to a starter. But we saw him in spring training, despite limited work, go out there, toss 5+ innings, 8 strikeouts, somehow on 37 pitches against Houston. The question I have now is, like, does this guy throw more than 65 pitches or so today?
So one thing that was really hard is yesterday, there seemed to be very little correlation with how much workload guys got in spring training with how many pitches they actually threw yesterday. Like Shane Bieber threw a ton of pitches yesterday. Logan Webb worked deep into the game after he capped out, I want to say it was 37 pitches the most he threw in spring training, and he still ended up going fairly deep into the game. The only reason he ended up coming out was because he started to get his ass kicked. I think it was in the 5th inning against the Padres. So I thought that some of the spring training pitch counts were going to be predictive measures. And then after looking at yesterday's slate, that ended up not really being the case. It was kind of
the only reason I mentioned it with Puck, though, is because this is he has not been a starter. He has no history in the majors of being a starter.
Yep. And by what Lofty's saying about zero, it's literally zero history. He's made 142 appearances in the big leagues, and it's 142 relief appearances, 0 starts. So it is something that is maybe a little bit of a concern in terms of how deep could he go into games. But the thing that we should feel good about is that the strikeout stuff has always been fantastic for him. It's going to decrease certainly as a starter. He's not going to maintain a 32.2% strikeout rate as a starting pitcher. But what I am going to lean on a little bit is just the projections that we have from some of the sites that look at projections for the entire year. And all of them are fairly bullish on AJ Puck as a starter this year, a guy who's expected to maintain the ERA in the mid to high threes, like 3.72, 3.88. Those are the different projection sources, what they're showing for him this year. And then still a guy who's projected to strike out anywhere from 9 to 10.5 hitters per 9 innings. So with all the projection sources kind of being in line saying that AJ Puck is going to project well as a starter from being a reliever, I can't really disagree all that much. And then if you look at our projections on the site as well, for DFS purposes, we have him as one of the top projected value pitchers on the slate, actually a 25.4% chance being one of the top 2 value pitchers. That's the best mark of any pitcher on the DraftKings slate. I'd be more apprehensive to play him on FanDuel, where we really do need 5 or 6 innings out of a starter. But on DraftKings, I think he could be in an optimal lineup even in only 4 innings.
Yeah, I'd be more apprehensive too if he was expensive. Like if his salary matched his skill set, but not the potential pitch limitations. But in this case, it doesn't, like, you're getting him at a cheap price point for sure. Also, against the Pirates lineup, that sure, the future doesn't look terrible for them. They've got a few young guys that could, end up panning out. But still, this is not a lineup, particularly in Miami, in a favorable pitcher's park, that's going to concern you. He is the 5th cheapest pitcher today. The only guys less expensive are Perez, Quantrill, Thompson, and Stripling. It's going to be hard to get away from him, even if you're worried that he only throws 70 pitches.
And one other benefit too, the Pirates are actually picking up a good amount of ownership. So there's a little bit of leverage to playing AJ Puck as well, because the Pirates as a team, they're projected for 9% ownership. So just like before, we were talking about how the Marlins looked overowned. The Pirates are also overowned in our top stacks tool. So there's leverage to be had by rostering AJ Puck when you consider the Pirates right around 10% ownership as a team.
You have any interest in stacks on either side? I know you touched on Miami a little bit here against Perez.
It's kind of the same deal on both sides in terms of I get a little bit of exposure to each the Marlins and the Pirates, but well underweight to what the field is doing. So my preferred side of this game, all things being considered, it's rostering AJ Puck, a little bit of Pirates and Marlins exposure, but less than what the field is getting to.
Okay. Fair enough. We can keep this one moving here. Wanted to pull something up real quick. Hold on. All right. Let's go New York, Houston. Carlos Rodon. So Carlos Rodon had a very, very, very injury-plagued season last year. Returned. People were excited about it. It never really looked good. He's healthy now, or he says he's healthy. They have a 4.5 run total. Houston at 4.8. Christian Javier on the other side. Let's start it off with pitching. Now, Rodon's getting no ownership whatsoever. He's at what, 2.9%, 7,600. So you're getting him at a mid 7K price point on DraftKings. And Javier is only getting 4%. Now, clearly 2 offenses with a lot of pop, not a terrible park in Houston. Yankees came back and won that game yesterday after Nestor Cortez got tuned up early. I'm just having a tough time getting to either of these guys with any confidence today. And that isn't to say that, like, you have to play only AJ Puck or Merrill Kelly, who's in, as good a matchup as you could possibly ask for at home against the Colorado Rockies. But I don't think pitching is all that great on this slate outside of a couple options, to be honest. You can say what you want about ownership. I don't think pitching looks all that good on the surface.
Yeah, there's some individual spots, like relative to price, like AJ Puck. Yeah, I'm not saying he's the best pitcher in the world, but I do like him for DFS purposes. But yeah, he's not somebody that I would look at and be like, oh, this guy's a stud, that I'm super confident or anything like that. And that actually is one of the reasons why Carlos Rodon is interesting to me as a contrarian option. He's only projected for 2% ownership, and he's not far removed from being a Cy Young candidate. There's a reason the Yankees signed him to a massive contract last offseason. And it didn't pan out last year. He was injured, like you said. And even when he was healthy, he sucked. He had a 6.85 ERA, 5.34 expected ERA. His strikeout rate was the lowest it had been in forever. So there are definite concerns with Carlos Rodon, and it's possible that now at the age of 31, so he's past the 30 mark, that maybe there's just going to be a drop in talent level, and the Yankees have just spent money very poorly on Carlos Rodon. But I also think that there's a pretty strong chance that he bounces back, because if you look beyond his 2023 season, 2022, 2.88 ERA, 2.64 expected ERA, and a 30+% strikeout rate for the Giants. The year before, 2.37 ERA, 2.68 expected ERA. He finished, I think it was second or third in the Cy Young voting that year, 34.6% strikeout rate that year. So we had 2 Cy Young caliber years for Carlos Rodon, signs a big deal with the Yankees, gets hurt, and now it kind of feels like he's being written off by the field and only 2% projected ownership. Yeah, the numbers last year were terrible, but pitchers do change wildly year to year. We've already seen that with Carlos Rodon multiple times over the course of his career. So if the field is not going to be rostering this guy at all, I'm willing to take chances on him at 2% in large field tournaments.
I get it. And you can make the argument too that he had another rough spring training, but spring training is it doesn't really mean all that much. I mean, do I look at it earlier in the year to see, is the velocity down? Are there other issues? Is this guy coming off a major injury? Sure. All of that stuff I think is viable, but take yesterday, right? You have somebody like, who was it? Who pitched for Minnesota yesterday?
Pablo Lopez.
Yeah. Pablo Lopez had a rough spring training. And then when they asked him afterwards, he was like, well, I was just trying new pitches out and new sequences out. He's like, none of it meant anything. I'm fine. And then he came out there and looked like Pablo Lopez again. So it didn't really matter. With Rodon, do I look at it sometimes, potentially a little differently? Sure, because last season was so rough. I guess it's different with Pablo Lopez. He had the best season of his career. But man, the thing about Houston that's tough is they are just so good against lefties. Like, they don't strike out. They had 4 guys last year that had sub 15% K rates versus lefties. And then the 2 lefties that you're going to see are like, oh, there's a little bit of respite there for Rodon going up against a couple of lefties. It's Jordan Alvarez and Kyle Tucker. I talked about this yesterday with Nestor Cortez. That is just such and I know they ended up, like, they got to Cortez early. He settled down. Still didn't have a great start, but God, it's such a brutal spot for left-handed pitching.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, I mean, for reference, we have Carlos Rodon projected for 2% ownership. My first round of lineups, I got him in 4%. So it's like, it's double the field on him, but it's just a mark that's so low, it's easy to be overweight. If you play 20 lineups and one of them is Carlos Rodon, you're way overweight to the field on him. So that's kind of where I'm looking at him as a potential contrarian option. But actually, where I have the most interest in this game is going to be the Yankees offense against Christian Javier. Javier had a fairly rough season last year, 4.56 ERA, 4.42 expected ERA. Here's what's really interesting against him from a DFS standpoint, though. He doesn't generate any ground balls at all. 25.6% ground ball rate. Everything hit against Christian Javier goes in the air. And what do we know about this Yankees offense? A crazy amount of power in it. We've got Giancarlo Stanton, Aaron Judge, Juan Soto in the lineup now. This is a lineup that is certainly capable of hitting home runs. And you got a guy in Christian Javier here who everything goes in the air against him. And typically, if you do see pitchers that give up a lot of fly balls, they have much lower than league average home run to fly ball rates. But that's not the case with Javier. He's an 11% home run to fly ball rate for his career. League average is 11.5%. So this is a pitcher who is profiling as being very homer prone going forward for his career. And this is a team that could take advantage of it in the Yankees. So current top stack odds, we have the Yankees at the 3rd highest mark on the slate and 7% projected ownership. So this is one of my favorite, not like crazy contrarian teams, but it's an under-owned team that I like being overweight to.
I'm with you. What was, I think, north of 1.3 home runs per 9 last year for Javier. Fly ball pitcher. Great point too. Talk about home run per fly ball rate at or above the average when you're. What was his fly ball rate last year?
Yeah, so he had a 25.6% ground ball rate.
Jeez.
I kind of look I'll kind of look at line drives and fly balls kind of the same for me personally, because it just, to me, anything that's hit in the air that isn't a ground ball has, unless it's a pop-up, has a reasonable chance to lead to an extra base hit.
I hear you. Yeah, those are some numbers that could get ugly quick when you're facing a power-laden team like the Yankees. And I'm actually running the Sims right now. I want to rerun it here. What was your Yankees exposure? Were you getting any?
Yeah, I got to a pretty good amount of the Yankees. As far as my stack exposure to the Yankees, it was about 3% three-man stacks, 3% four-man stacks, 8% five-man stacks. So for a team that has 7% projected ownership as a team, I'm about like double that right now.
Okay. I like that spot. I guess, though, the one thing we need to talk about, I know you have interest in the Yankees. I think we need to talk a little bit about Houston. Yes, they're popular. I get that. What if Carlos Rodon is just still not right? Like, what if he still needs a little bit longer to get right? You're talking a left-handed pitcher going up against, 7 righties and then 2 lefties again. Yordan Alvarez, Kyle Tucker. If things were to go south, it would happen quickly. Last year, he was dealing with injuries. I get that, but 2.1 home runs per 9 allowed. I think we have to at least consider, hey, maybe he's not back yet. Maybe something still isn't right. Maybe he won't be right. Because I know last year a lot of people chased him being right, and it never really happened. But, he allowed, 1, 2, 3, 4. He allowed a handful of home runs in spring training already, had a couple really rough starts where he got tuned up. I do wonder, they're expensive. They're not going to grade out well in the top stacks tool from a value perspective, and they're getting owned, so they're a negatively leveraged team. But there's real blow-up potential for this Houston team with almost a 5-run total today.
Oh, for sure. I have much more exposure to the Astros offense than I have to Rodon. The difference is Rodon is 2% owned. So it's way easier to get overweight to a 2% owned Carlos Rodon than it is to get overweight to an 11% owned Houston Astros, which is the second most popular offense on the slate. The only team projected for more ownership is the Arizona Diamondbacks, going up against Cal Quantrill. And I have a feeling that after what we saw yesterday out of the Rockies, people are going to be lining up to be stacking against Rockies pitching, regardless of whether it's in Coors Field or on the road. I've never seen anything like this for Lofty. I tweeted this out. Because of how bad the Rockies were yesterday, they went into the game something like 3-1 to have the worst record in baseball. We were halfway through the first game of a 162 game slate, and the Rockies moved from 3-1 to have the worst record in the league to plus 190.
What?
People were running to bet on the Rockies to have the worst record in the league because of how bad they were at the start of that game. It's a bit of an overreaction, but it's you have to be outrageously bad for that to happen.
It's clearly an overreaction, but that's amazing. One other thing that just from an overall kind of makeup of this slate that's a little bit different than stuff we would see in a lot of other slates, you're not going to have as tough a time paying up for good stacks today, because if you wanted to, like we talked about it, AJ Puck is 7K. Nick Pivetta is getting 23%. He's 8,000. If you're paying for Kirby, fine, 9,700. Quite frankly, I was a little bit surprised that he was getting north of 20%, but pitching's not going to cost you all that much, even on 2-pitcher sites.
Yeah, and it's the result of it being day 2 of the season where all the studs pitched yesterday. We don't have studs in quite the same way.
Or they're hurt, dude. Go look at how many good pitchers that would be starting opening day are on the IL right now.
Yeah, no, it's true. Garrett Cole, for instance, if Garrett Cole pitched for the Yankees yesterday, Carlos Rodon wouldn't be pitching today.
Yep. And that's just one. I'm telling you, there's 11 of them that are hurt that should be out there, but they aren't. So we'll see. My highest right now, the most exposure I'm getting to, let's call them good stacks, is Arizona and the Dodgers. Actually, Houston is a distant third among all those expensive ones.
Houston. Yeah. So, I mean, for Houston, it's one of the teams I get the most exposure to. It's just a little bit underweight to the field because of how popular they are, but it's certainly a very acceptable stat. Carlos Rodon, I don't really think there's a middle ground for him this year. I think he's either going to be close to what he was a couple of years ago, which is why the Yankees gave him the contract, or it's just he's over the age of 30. He's had numerous injuries over the course of his career. He's had shoulder issues. He's had elbow issues. He's had, I'm fairly sure he's had like hamstring issues at points in times. So Carlos Rodon is either washed or he's going to refine his form. And we're not going to know until after this game is over. So Astros certainly an acceptable stack, but at 2% ownership, I'm willing to take chances on Rodon. Not anything that's like crazy substantial to my portfolio, though.
Hey guys, few more days, 30% off your first package. Anything you want at stochastic.com. Promo code DINGER right on the screen. Link in the description and in chat. That's 30% off. You want the Sims tool, single sport, you want all access, you want a week or a month, you got it, 30% off. You want just the MLB lineup generator, which absolutely crushed last year. The amount of screenshots we got was ridiculous. Josh and me doing this show. And I think it's because people are going into some of these lower stakes contests, like, the mini max, the quarter arcade, these type, even, the $4, the four seamer. And they're going in there with a lot, with good tools, whereas other people, so much of the field doesn't know what they're doing in some of those contests. And we were just getting daily with the MLB lineup generator, so many wins rolling in. And I look forward to seeing that again. Or you want just the data, just the ownership, player projections, top stack tool, all of that for every sport, weekly or monthly. We have a data all access package too. So check it out. Link down there in the description and in chat. And I should say, Greg, because I would be remiss to ignore this and to not shout out a huge win from one of our subs yesterday. But how about the fact that Lone Hicks over on FanDuel, first place out of 51,000 for 100K on opening day, rocking the stochastic avatar.
Not a bad start to the season for I believe it's Lone Hicks. I think that's his username over on FanDuel as well. But yeah, he ended up winning it, and it was a pretty crazy sweat too. It was funny because Tom had messaged me about it. He goes, "Did you see that a sub won the FanDuel main yesterday?" Tom didn't know at the time. The slate was still ongoing. And then there was, because the game went into extra innings, the final game on the slate. And it was not a game with all that much ownership between the Marlins and the Pirates, but there was like 4 or 5 live lineups behind him. So as that game got stretched out, I was like, oh, this guy's going to get screwed if the game goes into like 13 innings, especially with the way that the extra innings start with players on second base. It's like eventually somebody's going to get a hit. Runs are going to have to be scored at some point. But yeah, he held on to win and was a pretty tight sweat. So a good start for users of the data over at Stochastic. We did have one person win the FanDuel GPP, and there's only so many people that could come in first in the GPP every night, but so far we're 1 for 1 on having somebody win.
Yeah, man. Anyway, we'd love to have you come join us. Plus, our premium Discord's included in that. So jump in the Discord, say hello. I know Greg's in there all the time answering questions along with everybody else. So link down there, description, chat. And if you ever have any questions about any of this, please don't hesitate. My DMs are open. Greg's DMs are open. Greg has tutorials on all this stuff too. So we want to help you guys understand how to use these tools and not just throw you into the fire being like, hey, good luck. That doesn't help anybody. All right, Colorado, Arizona, Cal Quantrill, Merrill Kelly. I mean, look, Greg, if you're just looking at this objectively and not really based on price point, but just like, hey, who should be the highest raw scoring pitcher today? I mean, got to be Merrill Kelly in this spot. I was looking this up for an underdog video I did today too. This dude was purely dominant at home last season. And some pitchers do have kind of extreme pronounced splits at home and on the road. He was excellent at home. He's only getting better. Rockies have a 3.7 run implied total. Just across the board, it's a very good spot for Merrill Kelly. He's the second highest priced pitcher on the slate. He's still pulling 31% ownership, but again, it's tough to overlook a spot like this. He's in a fantastic position against the Rockies.
Yeah, he was really good last year. The Rockies offense has always been terrible, particularly against right-handed pitching. A lot of times people will look at just like, hey, look, the Rockies have scored a lot of runs this year. It's like, yeah, because they play half their games at Coors Field. Like you and I could score runs if we were playing games at Coors Field. Everybody could hit at Coors Field. And Merrill Kelly also has a pretty interesting journey. He did pitch in the KBO at one point as well, which a lot of us are familiar with from the old COVID days where we had nothing else to bet on but playing MLB DF, or it wasn't MLB, KBO DFS at 3 a.m. in the morning. So that was shortly after we saw, or shortly before Merrill Kelly ended up coming over to the States. But yeah, he's been much better in recent years. We've seen him make improvements. And last year, the big improvement to Merrill Kelly is, especially from a DFS standpoint, the strikeout rate. Struck out 25.9% of the hitters he faced. Then you also consider this is likely the easiest matchup any pitcher is going to have the entire year. Is anytime a right-hand pitcher is going up against the Rockies and the Rockies are on the road, it's going to be a spot that looks very good for starting pitching. And you've got ownership going to Merrill Kelly, but it's not anything crazy. He's projected for 28.6% ownership. We were talking earlier about pitcher ownership being flat. There's not a single pitcher on the slate that is ownership north of 30%. If you guys are playing cash games today on FanDuel, Merrill Kelly's pretty easily the pitcher I think you want to be rostering. Then for DraftKings, for the security, also, I think you want to be playing Merrill Kelly in cash.
Man, I read a really interesting article the other day, and this was an old article that I came across talking about not just the Coors Field effect, but the reverse Coors effect, where Rockies offensive play, Rockies hitters actually performed worse outside of Coors, not just because of the altitude, but because they're pitched to differently in altitude, and they can't adjust to it once they're outside of the park. And then they ran studies that showed ex-Rockies players who ended up not playing at home in Colorado for 81 of their games anymore, that went on to play for other teams, saw a significant rebound in their stats playing away from home in the ensuing years. So it's more than just them being like better at home and horrible on the road. It's that they're actually worse on the road than your typical road team should be away from home.
Yeah. And the Rockies, honestly, the Rockies even kind of suck at Coors Field now.
Yeah,
as
they're
well.
so bad.
Like,
dude.
I actually think one of the it's not applicable to this slate, but I think one of the sneakier things we could do early on in the season is even rostering right-hand pitchers against the Rockies in Coors Field when the Rockies might be popular.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, strikeouts are harder to come by there, but there's certain pitchers that, you know, can strike guys out and generate a lot of ground balls and not let them go into those gaps at Coors. I'm with you. I think there's going to be opportunities there. But yeah, we spent a lot of time on Merrill Kelly. I think rightfully so. He's just in a excellent spot today. My early exposure is Huck being my highest owned pitcher and Merrill Kelly being my third highest owned pitcher right now. But, you know, you can always do ROI boosts. You can make adjustments here depending if there's certain guys you really want to get to. As far as these bats go, Arizona, unless you had any insightful things to say about either Cal Quantrill or the Colorado offense today, if so, I'm all ears.
Yeah, just don't play them. That's the most insight that I have to them. As
Yeah.
far as the Diamondbacks, it's the team I have the most exposure to by a mile. And this is one of these scenarios where just because a team is chalk, it doesn't mean that it's a bad scenario for them, because we have the Diamondbacks with the highest overall top stack odds on the slate. We have them with the highest projected ownership on the slate at 13.1%. There isn't even a team all that particularly close to them. We've got the Astros, the only other team that are over 10% owned, but we still have the the Diamondbacks with higher top stack odds than what their ownership is, and then running everything through the Sims. I mean, I'm just getting an astronomical amount of this team. They wind up in about a third of my lineups. So I think it's a really good spot against Cal Quantrill. They're going to be popular, but I don't think they're popular enough. Yeah.
And Cal Quantrill's never been a guy to give up a ton of home runs. But he's not particularly good either. Like you're not worried about this 5.85 xERA last time out, 5.43 xFIP last season for Cleveland, facing a pretty potent Arizona offense. I think you're going to have a tough time getting away from this spot today for sure.
And one other thing to add before we move on from him as well. Kyle Freeland pitched 2 1/3 innings for the Rockies yesterday, and they have a shitty bullpen. They do exhaust a lot of their bullpen arms yesterday. So you've got a shitty starting pitcher, a shitty bullpen, and a tired. It should be impossible for your bullpen to be worn down on the second day of the season. But on day one of the year, when your starting pitcher goes 2 1/3 innings, and then you try to throw in a long reliever, and he was only able to get 1 out How many pitches? Yeah, 31 pitches, 1 out, 6 earned runs given up by Molina yesterday. So they had to go 2 innings out of Beeks. They had to get 2 innings out of Vodnik. Then Mears came in and threw an inning. So the bullpen's kind of tired as well. It's just a terrible start to the year for the Rockies.
God, how deflating is that? It's so deflating. They had, what they have, 5 pitchers yesterday? Yeah.
Yep, 5
Brutal.
pitchers they had to burn.
Maybe they just throw Quantrill to the Wolves in the event that he's not pitching well. Just leave him out there for an extra inning or two. Burn through it.
Yeah, I mean, this could also be a spot where if the game gets out of hand, I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being a spot where we end up seeing him go to a position player pitcher. I was kind of surprised they didn't do it yesterday. Game 1 of the season, you're down by whatever was 15 runs. Like, why even using your relievers in that spot? Just throw a position player pitcher out at the end of the game.
God, can you imagine having to go to a position player in the opening day? Like, that's just...
I mean, I'm sure that's why they didn't do it, because they were like, we don't want to use a position player pitcher on day 1 whenever.
Not exactly a morale booster, yeah.
But I mean, how much morale what's changing morale when you're down by 15 runs in the first game of the year?
Right, it makes no difference. But I mean, this spot is pretty clearly Merrill Kelly and Arizona bats. It's what we're looking at here.
Absolutely.
Cleveland and Oakland. All right, so Logan Allen against Oakland. Let's talk about this. Oakland has a 3.8 implied total. Cleveland at 4.4. Logan Allen's not a bad pitcher. He's also not elite. He doesn't have particularly elite strikeout stuff. He's not bad. He's also not expensive. He's 7,600. My guess is you're going to get a lot of lineups with both AJ Puck and Logan Allen, which allows you to get to these Arizona stacks, Houston stacks, Dodger stacks, the expensive ones. But look, 22% strikeout rate last year. And that was, across a considerable sample size, over 125 innings pitched. He had a fine season. But again, 4.28 xFIP, 22% strikeout rate, 9% K rate. This was a perfectly capable yet pretty, slightly above average pitcher that today is pulling ownership of 21% against Oakland, albeit a very good matchup against Oakland in a pitcher-friendly park.
Yeah, so Oakland there's 2 teams that are on like their own tier of terrible. We get to talk about them in back-to-back games. We just went over the Diamondbacks against the Rockies and how bad the Rockies are. This is kind of a similar situation because the Oakland A's are neck and neck with the Rockies to have the worst record in baseball this year. They have a bad offense. They have bad pitching staff. They at least do have some interesting prospects. One thing I do really like about Logan Allen, outside of just the matchup, and like you said, he was good, not great last year, just, fine, middle of the rotation starter. Yeah, he was also a rookie last year, and he's one of the top pitching prospects in baseball going into the year. So I think it's reasonable to expect him to make some strides this year. And also, if you look at his minor league numbers, he was actually a very good strikeout pitcher in the minor leagues and wasn't terrible last year, 22.2% strikeout rate, but his K rates in the minor leagues, 30.2%, 27%, 35.6%, 32.9%, 33.5%. To me, one of the more logical evolutions we would see of Logan Allen's game based on his minor league stats would be him striking out more guys at the major league level. What better matchup to start doing that in than one against the Oakland Athletics and in Oakland to start the year? So Logan Allen, as far as cheap pitchers go, him and AJ Puck neck and neck as 2 guys who I really, really like getting to for cheap.
Yeah, and you're going to. I'm getting a lot of Logan Allen right now. Plus, another good thing, you don't need to get 10 strikeouts from him here. It's not, it's not necessary. He could just go deep into this game. It's entirely possible that ends up being the case. I think that if we were to kind of summarize what we've talked about thus far, would you put your 3 favorite pitchers as AJ Puck, Merrill Kelly, and Logan Allen? Or are guys like Musgrove, Pivetta, and Kirby sneaking into that conversation too?
No, it would be Logan Allen, Merrill Kelly, and AJ Puck for me. And also what's great about this is all those other guys you mentioned, while also being decent options, the ownership is the same across all of these guys. So if you guys are trying to figure out which pitchers you want to roster today, unless something wildly changed with our ownership projections, it's very similar. All these guys between Musgrove to Puck to Logan Allen to Kirby, they're all like 19 to 28% owned, all grouped together. So you really could just pick like who you think is going to have the best outcome relative to their price tag. And everything else is kind of the same as far as ownership goes.
Anything else for this one on either side? Cleveland
Yeah.
facing Ross Stripling today as well.
Yeah, so the Cleveland Guardians are a team that I'm getting a pretty good amount of as a stack. And the scenario where Cleveland looks good as a stack, number one, they are fairly low owned, projected for 5% ownership. They're also on the somewhat cheaper side. There are hitters you can roster towards the tail end of the Guardians lineup that you could save some salary with. But as far as offenses we can look at that are not projected to pick up much ownership, I think this is one of the higher upside spots that we have here in the Cleveland Guardians. And against Ross Stripling, who's been all over the place as far as his career is concerned. But one thing that you guys should look at if you're looking at Ross Stripling's career numbers, look at his splits as a starter and as a reliever, because his numbers overall for his career are not terrible, but he has been much better out of the bullpen for most of his career than he has been when he's been a starter. And that's always been a concern for me with Ross Stripling is like, all right, yeah, he can be a guy who's effective in an inning or in 2 or 3 innings. But generally, when he gets extended, it goes poorly for him. Last year, he finished the year with a 5.36 ERA, a 5.59 expected ERA, and that was pitching in San Francisco, a very, very pitcher-friendly ballpark. He also doesn't really generate strikeouts, 18.4% K rate, and he's 34 years old now, I believe. Yeah, 34 years old. So that's another concern is you got a pitcher who was already having the worst season of his career last year. Now he's going to be 34 years old. An Oakland A's team that is also just not playing for any. This is a very odd pitcher for Oakland to be throwing out there because why not just throw a young guy out on the field to see what he has? But yeah, I think this is a pretty good spot to stack against Stripling and the Oakland A's because I think that there's a pretty good chance that Stripling just has nothing left.
Very possible, man. You look at some of these numbers last year, not good. Also, he really struggled with power last season.
His whole career he has, but yeah, especially last year, the 22% home run to fly ball rate for his career, 15.1% home run to fly ball rate. So really, really high numbers. And don't forget, it's not just a 22% home run to fly ball rate. It was a 22% home run to fly ball rate, making half his appearances in San Francisco.
Yeah, it's not good. Half of them in San Francisco, and you still coughed up north of 2 home runs per 9. That's tough. That's going to be difficult. So I like Cleveland here, getting a lot of 5-man Cleveland stacks today. Same. And my guess is just because from a value perspective, they're not terrible. Like there's some, they're not cheap, but there's a few teams out there that just have really, really low value scores today. This isn't terrible, sitting around middle of the road in our top stacks tool. No, I'm sorry, sitting 4th in top value percentage in our top stacks tool. Also, we have them with the 5th highest top stack score as well. So yeah, Cleveland looks good today. I think once you get into this next game though, San Francisco and San Diego, 3.5 run total for San Diego, 4.2 for the Padres. Kyle Harrison on the mound for San Francisco. And then Joe Musgrove, the righty for San Diego. It looks like you're going to have a more difficult time getting to this San Francisco team than most other teams on this slate.
Yeah, there's really no reason to stack them up. It's not. You know, weird shit happens in baseball all the time, but across 150 lineups, I got 0 5-man stacks of the Giants. I got 0 4-man stacks. I got 1 3-man stack. So This is a very, very unappealing offense. As far as Joe Musgrove goes, he's definitely a good starting pitcher. He also had a lot of unlucky outings last year. And something else that really inflated his numbers as well. I used to bring this up a lot with Joe Musgrove last season is they played that game in Mexico City, which the elevation, they might as well have been playing on the moon. It was the most ridiculous elevation ever. Everything that was hit there, it was like a 600-foot home run. Musgrove had to make a start there, and it just killed his ERA for the entire season. So if you took that game out, his numbers actually look a lot better and do look closer to what some of his underlying metrics have been throughout his career. So I'm not going to say that Joe Musgrove isn't a good option on this slate as a pitcher. He certainly is. There's just a lot of guys I like more than him.
Yeah, he had a brutal spring, which, you know, you could say that for a lot of guys. 24% strikeout rate, it's above average. But the thing about Joe Musgrove is if you're playing him today, he's not cheap. Like he's the same price as Merrill Kelly. So I think you're going to have a more difficult time getting to to Joe Musgrove than Merrill Kelly. Is it the worst matchup against San Francisco? No, but Kelly's matchup is just so much better against Colorado.
Great.
So if you're doing that, I mean, you would say that it's a leverage play, but Musgrove, we still haven't projected it. Maybe this comes down throughout the day, Greg. I think you could make a much better argument for it if he wasn't getting 21% right now.
Even then, yeah, I mean, it depends like how much lower the ownership was, but relative to his price point, there are guys for cheaper that project comparably to him for us. And then if you're paying up a pitcher, like, yeah, Merrill Kelly's just the more obvious choice.
What do you want to do with the bats in this game? Like San Francisco, it's tough to make an argument that that's going to be a good spot, and we talked about that. But San Diego against Kyle Harrison against the Southpaw, is that a spot we should be looking to? Because we already talked about like 3 or 4 stacks that we like quite a bit.
I have some exposure to them, but it's not like any kind of real priority for me or anything like that. And Kyle Harrison also is a young pitcher who went into last year kind of similar to Logan Allen, as one of the top overall pitching prospects in baseball. And if you guys remember with Kyle Harrison, we saw some individual starts that did go very well for him. The overall numbers for the year left a little bit to be wanting. 4.15 ERA, 4.55 expected ERA. Did show some good strikeout stuff, had a K rate of right around 24%, and had some spike spots where he did have big K numbers. So if I had to roster an offense in this game, I would definitely lean more towards the San Diego side, but they're picking up some ownership. We have them over-owned in the top stacks tool. And as far as my 5-man exposures to them, I'm getting some. It's just less than what the field is. So not a game where I'm really prioritizing anything on either side.
All right, let's get to these final 2 games. By the way, we've talked about it plenty of times, but if you guys are not on Sleeper yet, $500 first match deposit bonus, not bad. Free squares every day, dynamic pricing. All of that stuff is going to play pretty heavily into your ROI. Even Josh always says this, like, even if you were just going into something like this, even if you're just going in and saying, I'm going to play the free squares every day, even with the limited amount you can put on each entry, it doesn't matter. Like, it significantly improves your ROI. Then you're essentially just free rolling in those spots. But up to $500 first match deposit bonus is bigger than any other pick'em site. The dynamic pricing that allows you to grab home runs and doubles and stolen bases and triples, unlike the other ones, and can up to 100x your entry, which is huge in and of itself. So if you're not there yet, check out Sleeper, link in the description and in chat, up to $500 first match deposit bonus and more free squares than literally anywhere else. All right, it's Boston and Seattle. Nick Pivetta, George Kirby, both of these guys getting ownership. I'm a big fan of George Kirby. He started off so strong last year, regressed a little bit, and then there's Nick Pivetta on the other side. I guess I was just a little bit surprised to see some of the ownership coming into these guys and not more going to Merrill Kelly. But maybe you can explain this one away to me.
Yeah, so I can't tell you why Nick Pivetta is projected for 20. I mean, I can't tell you why people are getting to him at 24%. The ownership projection is what the ownership projection is. Our ownership projections are pretty accurate. So unless it changes later, I just think Nick Pivetta is a relatively popular pitcher on the slate. And I don't agree with it. At $8,100 as an SP2 on DraftKings, there's definitely no reason to consider him on FanDuel. I don't really get very much exposure to the Mariners, but I'm kind of inclined to force the Sims to give me Mariner stacks just to get leverage off of Nick Pivetta if he actually does end up being 24% owned. As things currently sit in the lineups I built, I don't really get anything. I don't get Red Sox stacks. I don't get Mariner stacks. I don't get Kirby exposure. I don't get Pivetta exposure. That's the one thing I'd be willing to force into my lineups is Mariners stacks just to get leverage off of Nick Pivetta if this ownership ends up holding.
I like that. And Nick Pivetta is no stranger to having some total meltdowns.
No, not at all. There was a handful of slates last year I remember being really popular, particularly one off the Rays that comes to mind, where he'd be like 30, 40% owned and would score negative fantasy points. He's very high variance.
So for anyone that's new to the Sims tool, how would you go? What do you think the easiest way, if you're going and looking to force in some Mariner stacks, are you just ROI boosting the whole stack?
Yeah. So the easiest way to do it is, Jordan, you have this up here. Let's go to the ROI boost, Jordan. the ROI boost. It's because I'm an idiot. I'm clicking on it on my screen as if that's going to do anything. Yeah, you can go to the team stacks. You could boost entire team stacks. So this isn't going to change individual player exposures, but it will change the lineups that have stacks of these teams and make them show up more predominantly in lineup. So if you wanted to just go to Seattle and scroll down, because they're probably towards the bottom. Yeah, just go 15% ROI boost to Seattle, and then just go ROI boost. Then go to the lineups page and go, yeah, unfavored all, then favor your top 150. And now if you check our exposures, we had 3% to the Mariners before, and now it is going to be a little bit higher overall. So we now have, it's a little blurry on the screen, so it's hard for me to see, but it looks like the total exposure is what, like 7% or something?
And you can adjust those ROI boosts higher if you're trying to get more in. Like I did it last night on the night slate with pitchers. Just wanted to get more of a specific pitcher, less of a guy. It's not changing the lineups. It's just taking those lineups that were already made in the contest generator and boosting them up based on the ROI boost. So that's how it works. And it can be useful. You don't want to go crazy with it, but like Greg said, if he's trying to force in a little bit of Seattle and he's not getting any, that's the way to do it.
Yeah, and you just see like that little boost right there. It's not anything crazy, but we went from having 3% Mariner stacks to 7% Mariner stacks. And that would then have us, I think, fairly overweight to them. Yeah, they're only projected for 5% ownership as a team. So, just by doing those little boosts, it's ways you can manipulate your lineups and have a little bit more control over what the sims are giving you there. So that's the simplest way to answer your question. Get yourself to more Mariner stacks if you want to force it.
Ready to wrap this one up?
Yeah, man.
Let's do it. Zach Thompson, Bobby Miller, Dodgers, Cardinals. Dodgers 5.6 run implied total, Seattle 3.7. I mentioned to you earlier, I think one of the reasons that I'm getting to less Houston today against Carlos Rodon in a matchup that, could be just fantastic, or he looks good and they struggle. But I'm getting right now combined between 3, 4, and 5-man stacks, about 20% Dodgers, 7% 5-man stacks, 4% 4-man stacks, and 8% 3-man stacks to the Dodgers in this Sims run. I mean, it's hard to argue with something like that, given the matchup, given their implied total today as well, and the ability to play cheap pitchers in that 7K range.
Yeah, I think it's going to be the same situation with the Dodgers for me as it was yesterday, which is I hardly had any Dodgers 5-man stacks, but they were my most exposed 3-man stack yesterday. The team is so expensive that even if you're rostering 7K pitchers, it is kind of difficult to make a lot of 5-man Dodger stacks. But what it is viable to do is to play them as a secondary stack where you have 3 Dodgers or playing 2 Dodgers, where you could have a lineup that has like Ohtani, Betts, Freeman, and then maybe a cheaper stack around them. So it's probably going to be the same situation with me again today. I'm going to have a lot of 3-man Dodger stacks as secondaries, just a little bit difficult to make 5-man stacks of them.
It is. I think one thing that you're probably going to see here, just looking at some of my own lineups right now, is if you're getting the 4 and 5-mans, you're going to see some bottom of the order Dodgers popping up in your lineups for sure. Like that's just going to happen. 5-man stacking the 1 through 5, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 or whatever, that's going to be real tough. So I think you're just going to have to you're going to have to sacrifice some of the top options if you're trying to get additional exposure to the Dodgers. It's just the way it is, man. There's no ways around it. Like I'm looking one, Gavin Lux, Chris Taylor, both of them in this lineup. They're cheap. So there are actually cheap Dodgers. It's just not the Dodgers you necessarily would love to get to.
Yeah, like my best projected lineup is by Sim ROI in the first run I did here. It's a 5-man Guardian stack with a 3-man Dodger stack coming back, and then 3 Dodgers. It's Freddie Freeman, Shohei Ohtani, Chris Taylor. That's how I think a lot of my Dodger stacks are going to be. Like I was saying before, those 3-man Dodger stacks. 5-man, if somebody told me they were playing a 5-man Dodger stack, I wouldn't say there's anything wrong with it. I just prefer them as the secondary stack for cost reasons.
I will say, though, I'm looking at a couple here, 5-man Dodger stacks. They, let me put it to you this way. They look better than I would have thought. And this one is a Logan Allen, AJ Puck lineup. I mean, Will Smith, Greg, Freddie Freeman, this is Shohei Ohtani, Chris Taylor, Max Muncy, all in the same lineup with Logan Allen and AJ Puck. So it's doable. It's doable. Doesn't look that bad.
I'm trying to pull up my best 5-man Dodgers stack. And yeah, you're right. I mean, not that this would be surprising, but yeah, pretty much every Dodgers 5-man stack I have, the pitchers are Puck and Logan Allen. I think actually maybe all of them.
And then you're going to have one of like Chris Taylor or Gavin Lux or something like that.
Yeah. 3-man, I think is the way to go with the Dodgers.
Are you getting any Bobby Miller or any St. Louis bats?
Negative on both.
Yeah, me neither. I think this is mostly Dodgers. I have one St. Louis stack in this initial run here for that's it. And I don't think I have any Miller at all. It's tough. We can close with this just to get your thoughts before we go, and appreciate you guys hanging out as always. Don't forget, few days left on that Dinger promo, 30% off any package you want. And shout out to Hicks taking down 100K as a sub over on FanDuel on opening day. Just really great stuff. So Nolan said, how are you guys approaching the weather in this one? From what I saw before I started the show is that it shouldn't hit until later, or it won't be there at game time. I can't remember if it was before or after, but that it should be okay. What I wanted to ask you though is, how easy is it to get boxed out on all of these like 8 and 9K pitchers when you have Merrill Kelly, but you have Pivetta, Kirby, Musgrove, Chris Bassett, Bobby Miller, 5 of those guys, all within that 8 to 90, 700 range. Whereas several of them are still getting ownership.
What do you mean by boxed out?
I mean, I shouldn't even say boxed out, but I should say, like, given the ownership, given all of those guys, how difficult is it to get to them today?
I have no interest in. I mean,
I know that's how I feel too, but I'm just looking at them like they're owned. Kirby's owned, Pavetta's owned, Musgrove is owned. Even Bassett's getting 13%.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if that holds up later, because on the surface, I don't think they look particularly good for multiple reasons. They're just better options in that price. I hope the ownership holds at that level and it ends up being really spread out, because I think there are pitchers like Merrill Kelly just being better than Joe Musgrove and George Kirby as options, but the ownership's about the same on all those guys. So I just hope it stays what it is.
If it doesn't and they come down, Merrill Kelly's got to come up.
We'll find out later.
Yes, we will. Live before lock at 5 Eastern, I believe, Greg.
Yep. So it'll be myself and Bellman from 5 to 6 Eastern time, then the NBA live before lock right after that with Josh and Eric from 6 to 7.
Beautiful. Appreciate you guys hanging out as always. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll catch you back here for the next one. Peace.